Good morning. This is lesson number 2 in the series, which I call Awake, Not Woke. And we're focusing upon how all of this came and infiltrated America and how this anti-Christian movement really has honeycombed all of our institutions, and we're witnessing the demise of many of those institutions in America right now. And how did that all occur? How did it come to America? So that's what we're focusing upon in this particular lesson. I want to begin with this question and a statement regarding a Christian worldview. What is a Christian worldview? What is a Christian view of God and the world? So let's think about that for a few moments. A Christian worldview is, and this would be a basis from which to begin our thoughts this morning, and that is a Christian worldview, or a worldview generally, is a perspective from which you view all of reality. It is a framework by which you assess everything that goes on. So everything in the world, whether it be governments, human action, whether it be sciences, humanities, everything is assessed, history, everything is assessed by the lens of the Bible. What does the Bible have to say on the subject? And so it is a vantage point. A worldview is a vantage point from which we're able to view all of reality. That's what a Christian worldview, that's what a worldview generally is. But a Christian worldview is a perspective from which you see all of reality, and that is steeped in the Word of God. We understand what makes a person tick, which makes a person move, what are the motives of an individual. We understand group activities, we understand governments of the world, we understand sciences, we understand different modes of learning. All of that is a worldview, and a Christian worldview is what we're thinking about this morning. So that's what a worldview, generally speaking, is. Now, something interesting about it, and that is, it may be the case that we are not only, I should say perhaps, unaware of a worldview that we have adopted. Everybody has a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. It makes no difference who you are. You have a lens through which you are able to view everything in the world. But frequently, unfortunately, people are unaware of the worldview they have adopted or what really composes that worldview. For example, Christians like to say that we are focused upon the Bible and we have a biblical worldview, a God-centered worldview. And what God says on the subject settles the matter. However, unfortunately, for many Christians today, I'm speaking about members of the churches of Christ, we only have a worldview that not only is that, but it also has adopted different ideas and concepts of the world. For example, many of us have adopted the ideas of psychiatry and psychology, which really, generally speaking, majority speaking, is a materialistic worldview. A materialistic worldview that tells us what makes humanity do the things, or humans do the things they do. And that worldview comes from the world of psychotherapy. Consequently, they want to medicate it with physical medication. But frequently, we have adopted some of those concepts. Another area is, for example, in the sciences. In sciences, science generally, going back a few years, of course, back to the days when people believed that there was one God of the universe, they believed that science was simply examining what God has created, God's world. However, today, science has taken on a philosophical edge and teaches us that the world and everything in it, including man, is the result of many eons of evolutionary development. And so many Christians have adopted evolutionary concepts as well as a God-centered worldview, and it has tainted it, it has soiled a God-centered worldview. And the same thing is true regarding Marxism. Marxism, which is the basis of woke ideology, is a materialistic worldview. And many Christians today being exposed in the university, being exposed, unfortunately, in the churches, being exposed in the public schools, being exposed in the entertainment industry to Marxist ideals and ideas, have adopted those concepts, and it has tainted a God-centered worldview. And it no longer is exactly what it should be. So let's think more clearly about a worldview, a Christian worldview. This statement is made by James Orr, who wrote a book called A Christian View of God and the World, probably about the 1920s. A Christian worldview is not built upon two types of truth, religious and scientific, but on a universal principle, an all-embracing system that shapes religions, natural and social sciences, law, history, healthcare, the arts, humanities, and all disciplines of study. A Christian worldview is a whole organism. He goes on to point out, one who, for example, believes the Bible is the Word of God is committed to much else besides. He is committed to a view of God, what the Bible teaches regarding God. He is committed to a view of man, what the Bible teaches regarding man. He is committed to a view of sin. That is, the problem with men primarily is sin. The view of redemption, a view of the purpose of God in creation, and history, a view of human destiny found only in Christianity. So let's break this down for a few moments. A Christian worldview encompasses what? Number one, a view of God, that there is one God. Deuteronomy 6 and 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4, that there is no God but one. But the Bible teaches that there's more than one personality involved in one God. There are three personalities, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, Matthew 28, verses 18 and following. Not only so, but the character of God is revealed in the Bible. And we have, for example, God is love, 1 John 4 and 19. But at the same time, there is the wrath of God, Romans chapter 2, verses 4 and following, where he speaks about he reserves wrath for those who are in disobedience to God. So we have not only God is love, but we also have the punishment of God that comes at the end. But that's a view of God. The view of the world. What does the Bible teach regarding the world? The world is an artifact, that it is not human artifact, but it is an artifact created by God. But we're committed to much more than that. What the Bible teaches is that the world was created in 6 literal days, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11. We are told that the week, that is a 7-day week, was organized by deity in Exodus 20 to reflect the creation week. And he makes this statement, for in 6 days God created the earth and the heavens and all that is in them, and on the 7th day he rested. 6 days God created. That means a young earth. So we're committed to what the Bible teaches regarding the creation of the world. Not only so, but the world was created by God for man's use. Genesis 1:28. I went over this on the radio yesterday at length. Genesis 1:28 teaches very plainly that the world and all of its resources were created by God in order for man's usage. And man was to have, what are those words? Dominion over, rulership over the world, and he was to utilize the resources thereof. And the wording there is dominion, lordship over, and he is to utilize. That's the idea of Genesis 1 and 28. Dominance over the world. Now, we have a very opposite worldview held by the environmentalists today. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the environmental movement has a completely different worldview. They believe that everything has exactly the image of God, not simply you, but everything has the image of God. And you are no more valuable than a free-flowing river or a redwood forest. You're no more valuable than an animal or a bird or any kind of creeping thing. Everything is of equal value. Now, that's the idea of the environmental movement today. But a view of the world that is taught in the Bible teaches that the world was created for man's usage, and man was to have dominion over it, and he was to utilize it. And the word there is manage. He is to manage what we have. Number 3, it's a view of history. The view of history is very simple, and that is it's linear. It goes from one point to the other. For example, in Galatians chapter 4, beginning verse 3, he tells us that when we were children, and he's speaking about mankind in the Old Testament period, we were held in bondage under the rudiments of the world. Now listen to this wording. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that He might redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. The key phrase is the fullness of times. That is to say, when the time was right. So we have history in a linear equation. God was driving history to the time of Christ. And from that point, we're driving toward the end, that is the second coming of Christ. That's told us to us in Romans chapter 2. And He shall reward those who are faithful and patient. He shall reward those with goodness and eternal life, Romans chapter 2, verse 6 and 7. But those who are disobedient, they'll be rewarded with punishment. So history is linear, going to Christ and going to the second coming of Christ. Now, how is that different? And what differs in a secular viewpoint? The secular viewpoint has adopted paganism, such as Native American Indian religion, and that is everything is a circular movement. Everything's a circle of life. It's all a circular movement. And that is, as the old pagan religions taught, such as the Canaanites, Baal died every year, then he was resurrected somehow, and then the dying represented going into the winter period, resurrection was coming into the spring, and so that repeated itself over and over and over again. No, that's not what the Bible teaches regarding history. History is a linear equation driving to a specified point. A view of man. The Bible teaches that God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. Genesis 1 and verse 26. So we have man and woman, only two genders, and we have it that man is created in the image of God. I just want to take a side note right here, if I may. Once again, mentioning the environmental movement begins with a different view of the world and a different view of man. Al Gore said in 1992 book, which was called Earth in the Balance, which he's the grandfather of the environmental movement, he says, no, sir, man is not the only thing created in God's image. God's image is seen in everything in the earth, and we're just one strand in the earth's web. Now, what is that to say? It devalues man, placing us all on the same plane as everything. And that is the basic, bottom line, common denominator of the environmental movement today. It's a devaluing of man. Only the Bible teaches that man is made in the image of God, and it is only God's Word that elevates man and woman to the rightful place. Not only so, but the Bible teaches that we have a view of law and statecraft. Law is simply to be the expression of God's will in a civil society. That's all that it is. And when we see, let me mention statecraft as well. Statecraft is simply the science of organizing civil society after God's order, placing those laws that God has set in motion and organizing the society that way. That's the only way we can have peace. What happens when we disregard God and cast Him out? We're seeing that in America right now because law becomes skewed. And law no longer is an expression of what God has had to say at all, but is an expression of what the whim of men would like to say. Homosexuality, abortion being two of those things. Very, very sad. It's no coincidence that all of our founders in America, by the way, the founding of America was the first time in the history of the world that men were able to sit down. They had a God-centered worldview. Now, when I say that, people say, well, are you saying they were all Christians? No, not necessarily. I'm not necessarily saying not one of them was necessarily a New Testament Christian after the New Testament order of things, but they did have a God-centered worldview, and it was the first time in the history of the world that they were able to sit down and speak about and think about and debate about how we're going to settle a society after God's order. First time. And now we have cast God behind our back in America, and we're seeing the results of it on the streets and everywhere in America. Now, that's a God-centered worldview, and that was statecraft. Statecraft grows out of a God-centered worldview. So, that is a godly statecraft, I should say. So now let's move attention to something else, and I'm going to say this is called the road to Frankfurt. Now, Frankfurt is Frankfurt, Germany. Frankfurt, Germany was where the Marxist school was set up. It was known as the Frankfurt School after World War I. So basically the story is this, that Marx and Engels, writing the Communist Manifesto in the Civil War period of time, in our Civil War period of time, but Marxism did not really go as they wanted it to go. They were not able to cause a world revolution. I think this is kind of interesting as well, and that is that many people today in colleges are taught that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were all about peace-loving, and they simply had a communistic society, and that's all, everything's going to be really good. No, no, not at all. They began with an anti-God viewpoint, but he put right in the Communist Manifesto the forcible overthrow of existing institutions. Force. It's not about peace. Well, that manifesto moved people in an anti-God movement through Europe up until about World War I. But after World War I, they recognized that it was not going to be as successful in taking the world as they had hoped. And so they moved. They actually had a school there at Frankfurt, Germany, established there called the Frankfurt School, which specialized in what was called the critical theory. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And this is all antagonistic to God. That was, God was in the crosshairs. The Bible in the crosshairs. Christian people, you are in the crosshairs of this movement. So let's talk about it for just a moment. Karl Marx wrote in the manifesto, this is actually Friedrich Engels writing in the preface to it. He says, the history of mankind has been the history of class struggles, contest between exploiting and exploited, ruling and oppressed classes. The history of these class struggles forms a series of evolution. In other words, man is considered as a material object only. Material, that's it, materialistic viewpoint. There's no spirit in a man, and so everything is moved by class struggles. And they want to put you in a class, and that's how they're going to put it. So he had these different areas. He talked about, Marx did, and Engels, and those who followed him, social justice. Have you heard the term social justice? Well, we hear it all the time anymore. It's becoming so commonplace in America that we think it's part of American founding. No, it's Marxism. It's what it is, social justice. Now, what is social justice? Well, you see it right now taking place everywhere. Let me give you a couple little illustrations. To understand social justice, you have to understand social injustice. What's social injustice? Well, there are too many black people incarcerated in prisons. That is, per population, how many blacks versus whites in a population. Too many blacks. That is, a larger percentage of the black population is in prison more than whites. What does that mean? To Marxists, it is oppression, social oppression. The whites have oppressed the blacks. So what are we going to do about it? That's social injustice. What are we going to do about it? We're going to let blacks out of prison. That's what's happening in New York right now. They're not even booking them at all. Doesn't matter what crimes they commit at all. Why? Social justice. It's Marxism is what it is. It's done in order to create chaos on the streets. Are we seeing chaos on the streets? Absolutely. It's done also in the school systems as well. For example, Harvard University, Yale, all the colleges, the Ivy League colleges, well, even in Texas, University of Texas, there are too many whites in the graduate school programs, too many white people. What are we going to do about it? That's social injustice. We're going to have to turn it around, and we're going to put minorities in the program regardless of GPAs. Doesn't matter at all. I remember in the 1980s, this is back in the 1980s, I'm glad I can remember it, in Arizona where I'm from. I remember in Arizona State University, the graduate school department had perhaps about 30 openings in the psychology department for people that were applying. And they had about how many applicants? About 400 applicants. Now, what kind of GPA do you suppose you had to have to get into the psychology graduate program? What would you say? 4.0. That's fine, except They're all white. So what are we going to do about it? That's social injustice. What we're going to do about it? What we're going to do is we're going to have to put minorities in there, so they put American Indians and blacks and other minorities with a 1.5 GPA, and others were out. Doesn't matter, 4.0 or not. That's social justice. Now, you think I'm talking about over yonder? That's happening right here in Wichita Falls. That's in WFISD. So the rule is, coming from Texas Education Association, in my classroom is, and in all the schools in Wichita Falls, that too many minorities have gone to placements outside of the classroom, that is punishment placements, that is the school alternative placements, alternative settings. Therefore, what are we going to do about that? We're going to have to stop it so they have a quota on how many minorities can be taken out of the classroom. So what's happening in the classrooms? They're chaotic. That's what's happening right here. We have your daughter right here at Kirby Junior High. Out of control because, so Lori, their daughter, went to another school district. It's happening all over. So you can't keep teachers in the classroom. Social justice, that's what it's all about. How about religion? Karl Marx railed, he hated religion, and particularly Christianity. It was anti-God. Now, some communist movement said you can come in believing in God into the communist movement, Communist International, but you will soon disavow your beliefs. You're going to be taught differently. That's how they said it. Abolish the family. Friedrich Engels wrote a book in 1884. That was Karl Marx's partner. He said, the family is the problem. Now, how did the family come about? Here's what socialism, Karl Marx said he was a scientific socialist. Here's how the family came about. The family was contrived by wealthy people in history, wealthy men who wanted to keep their inheritance and their money with their children. They didn't want it to be passed around to the community at large. And so they invented the family so they can pass on their goods as they died. That's what the family is. So if we want to get back to the original mankind, at the beginning, Engels would say, and the Marxists will all say, get rid of the nuclear family. And that's the wording they used. And where have you read that? Black Lives Matter had it right on their website, get rid of the nuclear family, until they had so much flack they took it down. It is remarkable to me, beyond remarkable, that so many Christians felt they had somehow to get in line with the Black Lives Matter movement, which was started by Marxists, Marxist-trained individuals, had Marxism on the front page, and Christians lined up with it. How did that happen? Because we have been asleep at the wheel. That's why. We've been asleep at what's going on. Abolish the family. You will find that Marxists will always say the family is the number one thing we've got to get rid of. Mom, dad, and the kids. You cannot have it. And so abolish inheritance. That is, you're not going to pass anything on. It all goes to the state. But someone's got to be in charge of all of this. So that was the basic Communist Manifesto concept. But now they moved, remember, in post-World War I period to the Frankfurt School. And that was in the 1930s. They took Marxist philosophy, Freudian psychology. Who is Sigmund Freud? He was a sexual pervert, is what he was. You can read his story. You can check out a biography, and he was a pervert, is what he was. Sexual perverted. But he was most influential in psychotherapy even today. So they took Freudian psychology and ranked perversion, and they started the Frankfurt School. But that was during the period, 1930s, when what was the dictator that was rising to power then? Hitler. So they decided this is not a good place for us to be. So they moved to New York City, and they had the help of the father of American education, who signed the Humanist Manifesto saying there is no God. His name was, who's that? Do you know? John Dewey. John Dewey helped them move the Frankfurt School to New York City, and they took over what used to be called King's College, but now it's called Columbia University. And that's where they set up shop. And the Frankfurt School began right there. Now, let's talk about a couple of the people. One of them is Antonio Gromski. Gromski was an Italian Marxist. He traveled to Lenin's Soviet Union Vladimir Lenin, who takes Karl Marx's ideas and put them into practice, and he was a little bit appalled. He thought, these strong-arm tactics, we can't use this head-chopping-off thing in order to get Marxism into place. Instead, we have to undermine and honeycomb society from below. That's how we're going to have to do it. Now, he was a dedicated communist, and he hated God. That's common denominator among them all. Hated God. Hated the family. We're going to have to get rid of this. And so Gromski had his ideas, and they influenced also the Frankfurt School. Then one from the Frankfurt School was a German communist by the name of Rudi Dutschke. Rudi Dutschke helped organize student protests. Now, I want to stop here. I tire of hearing a lot of American people talking about the hippie movement of the 60s and how it was just people wanting to free love, and they wanted to break the bands of the authority of the family and so forth. Well, that's partly true. But it was a communist-inspired movement. Communists were behind all of it, and Rudi Dutschke was one of those people. They actually fomented rebellion on the schools, in the campuses, and in the families, and with young people. And that's what happened. So we have Kent State taking place, and it was all a student rebellion, wasn't it? Well, the Marxist concept of ideology in the Frankfurt School, the men's names, you should kind of be familiar with some of them. Max Horkheimer, who came up with what was called the critical theory, Theodore Orno, Herbert Marcuse. These are some of the men. Let's talk about primarily what we need to get to here, and that is, they said we need to attack, and particularly Western culture, and they have in crosshairs America, by three different areas. Number one, we're going to attack the family. We're going to attack the family, and we've seen that happen right now in America. Number two, we're going to infiltrate the academy. The academy that would be collegiate learning, and even all the way down into grade schools. And then number three, we're going to have an attack upon the culture, and we'll see how they do that. So number one, let's talk about the family for just a moment. The biblical family, and this is what God had set up from the beginning, Genesis chapter 2, man shall leave his father and mother, cleave unto his wife, the two shall become one flesh. That's a family. And that family is to raise children, rear children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Colossians 3, for example, gives us a great model. Colossians 3, beginning verse 18. Here we have, and I want you to think about the words that Paul uses here regarding the family. You'll see why they hate the family. Wives, be in subjection to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and Ephesians adds, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. In this passage, it says, husbands, love your wives, be not bitter against them. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. And then, fathers, provoke not your children. Now, here we have father, mother, children. 1 Corinthians 11 and 2 breaks it down even further. The head of Christ is God, the Father. The head of the man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man. Now, one has a hard time trying to skirt around God's order. God, the Father, Christ, man, woman. That's the order. But that is an authoritarian type of approach, according to the Marxists. And that taught people to obey authority. And we have to get rid of that, because you can't have obedience to anything at all. You have to have disobedience. You have to have chaos. So the family came under wide attack. Consequently, there was Georgi Lukács from the Frankfurt School. He was himself a sexually perverted man. He claimed that he had the sexual fantasies, and he attacked the family, number one. The family has got to go. Here's another man. His name was Willy Munzenberg. I suppose it's Willy Munzenberg in Germany. But he said that the family is the number one obstacle to Marxist takeover of America. The family. We've got to get rid of the family. And then there was also this man, Wilhelm Reich, a German Jew who grew up, once again, having fantasies regarding bestiality. They all were perverted in their thinkings, their writings. Sexual perversion galore. It was horrible just to look at it. You can't even talk about it in a pulpit, what they talked about and what they wanted to do to infiltrate society. That's what they were about. And they wanted to undermine the family. So they began. And we'll talk about this in a few moments, they began honeycombing underneath the ground in the universities. And what do you have? What do we have now in America? We have dysfunctional families completely in America, seemingly, don't we? That's exactly what's happened. And so they have been successful in that particular area. Number two was the academy. Remember, number one was the family. Number two, they're after the academy. By the academy, I mean schools of higher learning. So how are they going to undermine and get in the academy? Critical theory was the goal of change in society. Critical theory basically is, and woke ideology basically is, to make people hypersensitive to the wrongs that have been committed against you and against your class of people or against your race all the way back. So, for example, Marxism put on some different colors in the 1960s, and they focused upon gender and race. And they knew those were natural fissures in society, and they wanted to drive a wedge. So the wedge is this. If you're a black person or if you're a woman, you need to be hypersensitive to the wrongs that have been committed against you in society, and the people that have committed the wrongs are the white males. That's the problem. So that's what this is all about. Critical theory is all about making people sensitive to the wrongs that have been committed against them. But there are three ways they're going to do this. Number one, explanatory. They're going to explain it by awakening you to the oppression that you faced. And if not you, your class of people. You're a woman, you've faced oppression, you've not received the jobs that you should have gotten. Perhaps that they chose a man over you, and that's only because you're a woman and a man got the job. And on it goes. Same thing regarding blacks and whites. If a white person is chosen for a job, the immediate assumption is, over a black person is, that it's racism. And so that's what we hear all the time. That's what this oppression is all about. So explanatory, awaken people to the oppression. Number two, practical. Make activists of everybody. Activists. Now, you think about this for a moment. What's coming out of the colleges, goose-stepping out of the colleges? We don't have scholarship as we used to have, not classical scholars, not men sitting around with pipes and talking about the world. We have people on the streets, don't we? That's what we have. From the 1960s on, you can bet that the college-educated individuals were the ones who are most active in overturning our society. They're making activists of everyone. The professors. When I had we had to study on Islam, what do we have outside protesting? A professor from MSU with his students giving them credit for coming over here and holding signs up. Now that's what it's about. It's not about scholarship. Not about learning as much as making activists of all these people. Make them involved in protesting what's going on in America. And then normative, giving moral weight. They had to give moral weight. By the way, how, and this is very tricky, how are we going to give a moral imperative to people after we've taught them that there is no absolute morality? How are we going to do that? How's that going to be done? If there's no absolute morality, how are we going to impel them to take some kind of action, to pick up the gauntlet and move? Well, they have kind of a religious movement, and that is the environment, the green agenda. And so they find so-called absolution if they can watch their carbon footprint, and they can go protest you and make you watch your carbon footprint, make you buy these different vehicles, make you buy different things, make you get off gas-powered vehicles. That's all about climate change, and it's all about absolution. It's a religious belief. There's absolutely no science behind human-caused climate change. None. But it is a religious-oriented belief. That's the moral weight that they've got, and that's the only tool in their toolbox. So let's go to the culture for a moment. How are we going to undermine the culture? And that is primarily through arts and entertainment. Let me just give you an illustration of one individual, and he was an artist. of a generation ago, and he was representative of many artists of the time, and his name was Pablo Picasso. Now, Picasso, we honor him as a great artist, but Picasso was a communist. He joined the Communist Party in 1944. He was against America. He hated the God-centered worldview. He hated the family. And so you can see in Pablo Picasso's art, he might, for example, have an affair with one woman, and he'd picture her with a pencil sketch. It was just he's a great artist. He was able to draw. It's just beautiful. But he became dissatisfied with her over a period of time, and then he had all this peculiar art that was all wonky looking. And that showed his feelings toward her, and he cast her aside, got another woman, he did the same thing, and it went on and on and on. That's what he was about. It was deconstruction of America. Here's an example also. This book was written, I've recommended it. If you haven't read this book, you ought to read this book, Hollywood versus America. Michael Medved, a Jewish movie critic in 1992. Now, I put on the right just the chapter titles. He points out that the entertainment industry, by the way, filled with people with a Marxist, communist worldview. And he says, number one, the movies have a bias for the bizarre. They make everything very bizarre, very dark, very macabre. How do they picture clergy in movies? How do they picture clergy? Always as a numbskull, don't they? As an idiot. He's the bad guy. He's always the bad guy. He's never a good guy. It's hard to believe that Chariots of Fire was produced by Hollywood maybe, 40 years ago? They would never produce that today. No, because it upheld Christian principles and people who believed in those principles and stood with them regardless of the culture. In his chapters, he talked about promoting promiscuity. That was the chapter title. How promiscuity simply took over all the Hollywood movies. Maligning marriage. You see couples sleeping together. You don't find any nuclear family in Hollywood any longer, at least as predicted on the silver screen. By the way, some people say, well, it's all about money. It's all about money. It's how much money they make. No, it is not. Michael Medved shows over and over again from the writings of the producers, the directors, that they know they're going to lose money, but they produce it anyway because they're wanting filth to be pumped into American minds. That's what. They know they're losing money on certain films, but they do it anyway. And they confess it. It's not all about money. They don't like a Christian worldview. And so kids know best. That's one of the themes of Hollywood. You know, the parents are bumblefoots, and the kids always are the wise ones, and the parents are stumbling around trying to figure out what's going on. Or you have the urge to offend, or the infatuation with foul language, which is inserted regardless of whether they need it or not. They just put it in there. Addiction to violence, hostility to heroes, on and on it goes. Let me mention this as well. Several years ago, in the 1990s, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but was I guess not produced, but it was actually exposed, and it was given light to, and that was secret papers of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. And these secret papers are called the Winona Documents. And the Winona Documents point out that through the 1940s and 1950s, that they indeed had Hollywood in the pocket of communist ideas and ideals. And that, believe it or not, that Senator Joe McCarthy was right on every one of the people that he fingered, pointing out that they were communist spies or that they had communist ideology. Now, that's unpopular to say today, because today the standard treatment is we don't want to go back to McCarthyism. We don't want to go back to seeing a red under every bed. But the Winona Documents point out, yeah, he was right, and they knew it. And how much publication have you heard about the Winona Documents? None. None. But he was right about it. He's been blacklisted by history because of his stalwart stance against communism, but Hollywood was right there involved in it completely. So I want to show you one thing in conclusion regarding Jodi Allard. She is a columnist for the Washington Post, and this is where we are today as a culture. And she writes in 2016, not many years ago, regarding her family. Now, she was a single mom. She had a couple of teenage boys, and she would come to the table, and she would, as a feminist, she would address all these feminist issues. She would address homosexuality, and she would just continue to poison their minds with all this ideology. That we're talking woke ideology. And finally, one day the boys kind of rolled their eyes and said, "Mom, do we have to have this talk again?" And she turned around and wrote a column, I should say, in the Washington Post about her sons. Amazing. And here's what she said. "Quiet misogyny, hating women, is still misogyny by virtue of being born male." You hate women because you're born male. She declared her sons were guilty. "I know I'm not supposed to cast an entire sex with a single paintbrush, not all men, but if it's impossible for a white person to grow up without adopting racist ideas, you can't do it, you're white. Simply because of the environment in which they live, how can I expect men not to subconsciously absorb at least some degree of sexism? White people aren't safe, no matter how much I'd like to assure myself that these things aren't true." And that's where we are. Isn't that not only bizarre and sad? You see the hypersensitivity going on here? Not giving anybody any credit for anything. No, this is what is taking place. This is why America is fracturing right now. And she's even charging her own sons that way because they get tired of year after year, week after week, lecturing about all of these racist ideas that she has. Well, I want to conclude with Ephesians Chapter 6. The passage was read in your hearing a moment ago. "Finally, brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might." Paul was admonishing us that we're in a war. That's what Christianity is. We're in a war. "Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the entire or the whole armor of God that you might be able to stand against the wiles, stratagems of the devil. Our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places." That is to say, there are spiritual forces at work behind the scenes. I don't understand all of it, but I understand exactly what Paul had to say. Spiritual forces working behind the scenes. "Wherefore take up the whole armor of God, that you might be able to stand in the evil day," that is the day of battle. "Stand therefore, having girded your loins with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Withal take up the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the evil one. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, praying at all seasons in the Spirit." Our war is now being waged, and it is high time for Christians to recognize the battle is on. And we need to arm ourselves with the Word of God, answering the false ideas of woke ideology as well as other ideologies that are in the world today. The lesson is yours. If you've been unfaithful, now's the time that you can make it right. As we stand and sing this invitation song led by Brother Kent, come to the front, please.